Good morning, everyone. How's this? So I just want to thank you all so much for being here. We're very fortunate to be joined by someone as accomplished and prolific as today's guest is. Before we get started, I would like to give a not-so-brief introduction. Nicholas Meyer is an award-winning author, screenwriter, and director. His first book, The 7% Solution, was later adapted by him into a film by the same name, which received an Academy Award nomination for Best Screenplay. In 1979, Nicholas would write and direct his first feature film, Time After Time, starring Malcolm McDowell and Mary Steenburgen. A short while later, Nicholas would find himself on the bridge of the USS Enterprise, where he would be tasked with directing and rewriting what would become one of the most lauded science fiction films of all time, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. Nicholas didn't stop there. On November 20th, 1983, more than 100 million Americans tuned into ABC to watch the debut of Nicholas' most influential film, The Day After, about a fictional nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union. President Ronald Reagan later credited the film in his memoirs as leading directly to the signing of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty by himself and Mikhail Gorbachev in 1987. Since then, Nicholas has continued to direct, write, and pen novels, including his latest, Sherlock Holmes and the Real Thing, which he's excited to speak with you all about today. Everyone, please help me welcome Nicholas Meyer.
Thank you very much
you're
for
welcome.
those kind words of introduction. I'm not sure yet whether I should stand or sit, but thank you for coming out in this terrible weather. Yes, I drove down from Los Angeles where the snow has stopped. And it's a great pleasure to be here and see so many Holmes fans, which I assume we all are. I also assume that a lot of the biographical information that I could conceivably present is probably already available to everybody. Nowadays, when people go on dates, they look up your income online before you so I'm not going to worry about all that. I was born in New York, and at a very fortunate time. It was the end of World War II, and we were the good guys. You remember that? And my father was a doctor, and my mother was a concert pianist, so I enjoyed a rather privileged upbringing. New York back then was like Disneyland, only it wasn't plastic, it was all real. And there was such a thing as a middle class, and a middle class family could go to the ballet and the opera and all sorts of things, and I lapped all that stuff up. It just looked great to me. They had to drag me places. I was a very incurious child, and one of the reasons they had to drag me was because they insisted, even at Columbia University football games, that I wore a necktie. And I conceived a lively detestation of this article of clothing. I sometimes think I went into the movie business because I learned you didn't have to wear a tie, although if you look at old photographs of movie directors, they are wearing ties, but I arrived at a fortunate post-tie period. I've since made my peace with the necktie. In any case, my father, who was a very interesting man, and he sort of saw to it early that I was an artist or I was nothing. And so that was the plant that got watered. And he introduced me to many things. A lot of music, a lot of books, a lot of Alexandre Dumas, a lot of Jules Verne, and also Arthur Conan Doyle. At about age 11, I think, he gave me the complete 60s Sherlock Holmes stories. There's a reason, I think, why childhood experiences of people, of art, of events, of even scenery, is what we call an impressionable age, because it makes a big impression. And you bond with these things, and you remember the books that you discovered as a child, or the movies, or some people remain traumatized by Bambi. Just saying. Anyway, I fell in love with Sherlock Holmes. And I also, somebody said, when did you first begin to write? Well, when did you choose to be a writer? I never chose any such thing. I think I was minding my own business, but it was something that I just always did. I can't read numbers very well. I can't read a contract, but if it says once upon a time, I'm there. And so that's sort of the way I operate. And one of the things my dad also said, that when you are studying to be an artist, they send you into a museum with an easel and some canvas, and they say, copy this, start with that. So I decided to copy Sherlock Holmes. And I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, but I just kept doing it. I don't know why I was so interested. I think, for example, this is going to be a talk of free association, I hope you put up with it, that detective stories are popular because they deliver exactly the opposite of what they promise. They promise thrills and chills and things that go bump in the night, and the body lying at an unnatural angle, the limbs splayed, and the head bashed in by a blunt instrument wielded by person or persons unknown. And people like to curl up with a good mystery. They like to take the mystery to bed with them, and a more intimate conjunction could hardly be imagined. So what is it that makes these things so popular? And I think that it has to do with detective stories are oddly reassuring. The real world is chaotic. I don't have to tell anybody here. It makes no sense. It's random. It's arbitrary. You get struck by lightning. You get slipped on a banana peel. But in detective stories, as somebody remarks sooner or later, it all adds up. And how comforting, the fact that it all adds up. So even the most authentically researched procedural, in which all the details are nailed down, and there are obviously detective stories that defy this simplistic overview and provide general thrills. I mean, I think Oedipus is probably the earliest detective stories, right? He goes looking for the murderer. Everybody says, don't stick your nose in this if you know what's good for you. But he does stick his nose in it, and with the murderer he's looking for turns out to be himself. That's Agatha Christie worthy of, but it obviously goes beyond that. I'm just saying, detective stories, we like them because I think they are obscurely reassuring, even though they pretend to be nothing of the kind. Anyway, I grew up in New York, exposed to lots of wonderful things, and I just thought it all looked great to me. I was not a very good student. Nobody knew what ADD was, so they just thought I was sort of slow. And then I went to the University of Iowa to the writer's workshop. And Donna is here somewhere, I know Donna from Iowa City, which is a great place to be, I have to say. I was very happy there. And while I was there, I learned that, yeah, I probably had some ability. We won't go so far as to call it talent. We'll just stop at ability. And so I was doing things that were right, but I was doing them sort of on instinct. And if something didn't work, I didn't know how to fix it. And at Iowa, I learned about how drama works, because I was a dramatist at that point. And by the way, for the way drama works is the playwright or the screenwriter asks a question, and the audience stays to find out the answer to the question. And when the question is answered, you go home. Will Hamlet kill the king? Will Romeo get Juliet? And so forth. And it is the job of the dramatist, once the question has been established, to raise as much suspense as possible as to the outcome of the question. So Hamlet sees Claudius, I could kill him now, but he's praying, he might go to heaven, bad idea, and so forth. There's a subplot with his girlfriend and so on. So I learned a lot of cool stuff at Iowa. And eventually I wound up in Southern California, because you didn't have to wear a necktie, and trying to break into the movie business, and I got lucky. And while we're on the subject, somebody recommended a general to Napoleon and said, this guy is a very good general. And Napoleon said, I know he's good, but is he lucky? You're looking at lucky. I have been fortunate in my time in California, Los Angeles, the movie business, to have been treated so kindly and so generously and loyally and supportively by people I probably tried their patience a lot. Because you won't believe this, but I used to have many rough edges. But that's all changed. Anyway, I started writing movies for television, and then, wouldn't you know, the Writers Guild went on strike, which we do whenever we get the chance. And so I wasn't allowed to write screenplays, and the woman with whom I was living said, well, now you can write that Sherlock Holmes meets Sigmund Freud novel that you keep yakking about. And she was right, that I certainly had nothing else to do except march back and forth in the sun with a placard. And so I sat down to write my own Sherlock Holmes novel. I had been reading a lot of other people's imitations of Holmes, and I have to say, I despised almost every Sherlock Holmes movie I've ever seen. I'm basically a progressive, bleeding heart, liberal, you name it, except in matters of Sherlock Holmes. I only like Arthur Conan Doyle. I only like the original stories that so hypnotized and affected me at that impressionable age of 11 when I was reading those 60 stories, 56 short stories and 4 novellas. So when I sat down to write my own Sherlock Holmes novel, I was wanting to do it as a corrective to all those movies that I despised. I couldn't stand Basil Rathbone as Sherlock Holmes. Sorry. What I really couldn't stand was Nigel Bruce as Dr. Watson. I never understood. Why does a genius hang out with a buffoon? It seemed simplistic, and I never believed that the Nigel Bruce character was the narrator of the stories that I was so fascinated by. So I wanted to rewrite how Watson was. Somebody noticed, and I was not the first, that there were relations between Sherlock Holmes and Sigmund Freud. When I was a kid, and people would say, "Oh, your old man's a shrink, is he a Freudian?" And I didn't know. So I said, "Pop, are you a Freudian?" And he said, "Well, it's kind of a silly question." And I said, "Oh, why is that?" And he said, "Because it's no more possible to discuss the history of psychoanalysis and not at least begin with Freud than it is to discuss the history of America's discovery by Europeans and not at least begin with the Vikings or Columbus, take your pick. But to suppose that nothing has happened since the Vikings, that's pretty doctrinaire." So a lot of things have happened since Freud, but you gotta sort of start with Freud. And by the way, he said, even if every single theory of Sigmund Freud's turned out to be incorrect, that would not invalidate his claim to genius. And I said, "How does that work if all his theories are wrong?" He says, because the proper comparison with Freud, again, is Columbus. Sigmund Freud was the first non-artist to set foot on a hitherto uncharted, unknown, unexplored territory which we call the unconscious. And if his maps are subsequently proved to be in error, does anybody remember or care that Columbus thought he was in India? I said, "Oh, okay. Well, this was a lot to take on board." But it was fascinating to me, and I found myself wondering how much Arthur Conan Doyle knew about the writing of Sigmund Freud and vice versa. And the first thing you realize is, oh, they're both doctors. That's kind of interesting. And they both died within 9 years of each other in the same town. Now these coincidences are really beginning to pile up. There's a lot of dots floating around waiting to be connected. And waiting to hear what's next, Holmes turns out to be a cocaine addict. Addicted to, 7% solution of cocaine. And so, for a time, was Sigmund Freud. He used it to combat depression. Eventually, he weaned himself from it when a friend of his died from the addiction. He never publicly renounced it, but he did write a paper on cocaine as an anesthetic during eye surgery with two doctors, Königstein and Köhler. And guess what? Arthur Conan Doyle studied ophthalmology in Vienna. How many dots do there have to be? And later on, you learn that Freud's favorite bedtime reading, wait for it, was the Sherlock Holmes stories. And Freud was also aware that he had been compared to Sherlock Holmes. In fact, at one point, he even compares himself. He was narrating one of his case histories, and he writes, "I followed the labyrinth of her mind, Sherlock Holmes-like, until it led me to..." Oh, you got the idea. And also, when you read the case histories, Freud's narrative voice sounds an awful lot like Watson's. All of this led me to write my novel. Writing is a pretty lonely business, especially if no one has ever heard of you or gives a shit. And when I finished, I thought, well, this is publishable. And I sent it off to, I had an agents on the East Coast, and they said, well, there's really no point in my reading this because I've never read any Arthur Conan Doyle, so how could I tell if it was any good? And to give you an idea of my rough edges, I said, well, putting aside the fact that you call yourself a literary agent and have never read any Arthur Conan Doyle, I would have to say that if this depends on Doyle, it's already a flop, which struck me as an unassailable line of argument, except she hung up long since. Anyway, I won't belabor the history of the 7% solution. I can tell you nobody was more surprised than me when it became the #1 bestseller in the United States for 40 weeks. And then He Who Laughs Last. And then came the movie, and I said, well, I'll sell the book, but I have to write the screenplay. And then, again, lucky, I got an Academy Award nomination, which in retrospect may be better than winning. Maybe that's just exculpatory, but sometimes winning is the kiss of death. In any case, I've prospered in Los Angeles. I've made movies and been lucky with them as well. But I kept writing Sherlock Holmes novels when I would get good ideas for it. They're fun to write. I like Victorian prose. I'm a big fan, whether you're talking about Charles Dickens or George Eliot or Robert Louis Stevenson or H. Rider Haggard, Edgar Allan Poe. I worship English. I like Shakespeare best of all, but I can't do it. But I can fool around pretending to be Doyle, which brings me to sort of the seventh novel, which is probably the last one, because I think any more after this and I'm veering into self-parody. I don't want to sort of trot out the same Victorian expressions for the umpteenth time. I'm running low on them, by the way. But I got interested in forgery because in late 1974 or early 1975, my publisher sent me on a book tour. That was back when publishers paid for book tours if you had written a best-selling book. So I was this kid author flying through a terrible thunderstorm, landing in Pittsburgh, where I was met by a reporter about my own age, who clearly thought this assignment was unworthy of his talents, interviewing this kid, smart-ass, whatever. And so he began by saying, how does it feel to be a successful forger? And I was still green about the gills from this rather shaky landing. And I said, well, it doesn't actually say by Nicholas Meyer, it says as edited by. And we went on from there somehow. But I lay awake in a strange hotel that night, thinking about what he had said and realizing that, yes, I am in fact a forger. I did it in a spirit of fun, but yeah, I was pretending to be Watson, or pretending to be Watson, pretending to be Doyle. I was pretending, and it got me interested in forgery. Got me very interested in forgery. Forgery is a very perplexing topic. It's perplexing ethically, legally, aesthetically, culturally. It's damn perplexing. What is the difference, for example, between a forgery and a copy? Something you can't see. The intention. The copy announces itself. I'm a copy, you can buy me at the museum store. A forgery is trying to fool you. I'm the real thing. And then there are, things that aren't exactly forgery. The French call it à la manière de, in the style of. So it's, and this is where AI is having a field day. you know, paint me a Van Gogh, and it'll come out and it's sort of maybe a little bit like a Van Gogh, but it's not exactly a forgery. What's the difference between forgery and plagiarism? The plagiarist tries to pass off somebody else's work as his. The forger tries to make you believe that his work is someone else's. I came up with that all by myself. I had to rewrite it a bunch of times. In any case, so I assembled a big library about forgery, and I got very interested in certain forgers. But I'll say something else that's interesting, at least to me, about forgery. All works of art, books, music, literature, doesn't matter, painting, are ineluctably, inevitably, products of the time in which they were created. Mozart doesn't just sound like Mozart. He sounds like mid-18th century European orchestral music. Renoir doesn't just always look like Renoir, he looks like late 19th century French Impressionism. It's unavoidable. If I were to show you 4 movies that are set in the year 1776, I would wager that within 5 minutes and 5 years, you could date when each of these 1776 set movies were made. The eyelashes, the costumes, is it color, is it silence, is it black and white, is what are the sentiments, the political ideologies and so forth. You date it right away. Okay, we can all live with the reality that all works of art are ineluctably products of the time in which it was created. But I have to tell you, this plays hell with forgers, because their work too is the product of the time in which it was created. To take an example, and I'll wind up with this because I'm talk my head off here. The famous Dutch forger Van Meegeren, Han van Meegeren, in the 30s, produced forgeries of Vermeer. And these Vermeer forgeries were sold for astronomical sums of money. The first one was unveiled by Queen Wilhelmina of Holland at the Boysmans Museum amid great fanfare. But look at them now. They suck. They're terrible. They look like Art Deco, and not very good Art Deco either. How did they pass at the time? But time itself has thrown them into sharper relief, because all works of art, even phony works of art, are products of the time in which they are created. Anyway, this reporter's remark back then in Pittsburgh has stayed with me, and so my last Sherlock Holmes novel, the one that they had some copies of here, Sherlock Holmes and the Real Thing, get it? Is where I chose to sort of end up. Anyway, I'm not sure exactly what I was saying, but Henry James said that the least demand that you can make of a work of art is that it be interesting. So I hope I quit while I'm ahead. Thank you very much.
All right, if you got a question, put your hand up, and I'll make my way. I'm going to do.
I'd like to thank you for coming today. I appreciate it. My husband's a Star Trek fan, so you didn't talk about that, so maybe we can talk a little bit about that if you don't mind. But my question is when you do a mystery, do you plot it out from the beginning to the end? Do you know what's going to happen before you write it? Or do you write it and it just progresses?
I wish that all my answers weren't so long. Madame de Stael wrote a letter. She said, I'm sorry this letter is so long. I didn't have time to make it shorter. Socrates was told by the oracle at Delphi that he was the wisest man in Greece, and he figured that can't be right. And all I need to disprove it is to find somebody wiser than me. So he goes searching through all sections of Greek society until finally he comes to the poets. I think he means artists, and back then, of course, it was all guys. And he said, these men who write and paint and sculpt so insightfully about the human condition are bound to prove wiser than me. He said, imagine my surprise when I found that the poets were the stupidest people I spoke to. They were like children. They were infantile, except when they did their art. And then they go into a kind of trance and take dictation from God. And this they call inspiration. And later they come up for air and then they go back to being jerks again. And so when I'm asked how I do things, the real answer is I don't quite know. There are two basic creative methods, I think. We'll call them the Mozart method and the Beethoven method. Mozart could do it all in his head. He liked to shoot pool. He was apparently a good pool player. He'd write the thing in his head, and then he'd copy it out. There were very few corrections in a Mozart manuscript. There are very few corrections in Arthur Conan Doyle's manuscripts, by the way. You look at them, not a lot. But look at Beethoven's sketchbooks, and you see the whole process is hideously externalized. It looks like a demented chicken crossing the staff paper, and the amount of different times to get to where he needed to go. There is a famous Leonard Bernstein recording on Sony, which I think Sony owned RCA at some point, in which Bernstein and the New York Philharmonic play all the alternate endings that Beethoven used and rejected for the Fifth Symphony. And you can see the whole process. Why and Bernstein will say, well, you can see this is too short, or this has no themes that are related to the other parts of the thing. So you can see it. Plato didn't want artists in the Republic because we're liars. Which is true, and when people say, how did you do this? Since we don't know, because we weren't there, we make up stories about it, because that's what writers do. So Gilbert said that he got the idea for writing the Mikado because he was sitting at his desk and a Japanese samurai sword that was hanging over him fell down and almost decapitated him. Good story. Maybe even the damn sword fell. It just doesn't explain how he wrote the Mikado. You see the problem. As far as Star Trek is concerned, very quickly, it's not going to be quick. I had never seen Star Trek. I didn't know anything about it. When I was a kid and it was on TV, I was in college. And I saw the man with the pointy ears, and they were all running around in Dr. Denton's, and I just kept going. So I think it's fair to say, with my very few powers of observation, very different from Sherlock, I missed everything that was important about it. I missed everything that was innovative about it. I missed the interracial, everything that women in positions of power and African Americans or Russians or Asians, missed all of that. It just looked dumb to me, and I didn't watch it. And then somebody said, you should meet Harve Bennett. He's been assigned to do the second Star Trek movie. And I wound up being sort of badgered into meeting him. And I liked and then grew to love him very much. And he showed me the episodes, and he showed me the first movie, and I thought, what is there about this that I really like? I'm giving you the short version. And not being the sharpest knife in the drawer, it took me a while, but what I really liked was, it put me in mind of something else that I read when I was about 12 or 13 years old, were the adventures of Captain Horatio Hornblower, who was a captain in the Royal Navy during the Napoleonic Wars. He had a girl in every port. When you're 13, this sounds pretty cool. I'm pushing 80, it still sounds kind of anyway, I thought, oh, this is Captain Hornblower in outer space. I could do that. And that's how I got involved in it. And that's the short answer. Anyway.
One question only, everyone.
Thank you. I have a previous engagement, so I have to keep it short. I love you.
I am short.
Fabulous. You mentioned Vermeer. Have you seen Tim's Vermeer?
Yes, I have. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
Yes.
I haven't seen it. Be sure and see it. Yes.
Thank you. Of all your work, what are you most proud of and why?
Well, first of all, I don't think artists are the best judges of their own work. You know, Arthur Sullivan, who was supposedly the English Mendelssohn, the shining white hope of English music in the Victorian age, was always kind of annoyed that what he was being remembered for were not his symphonies or his big opera Ivanhoe, but rather his operas that he wrote with Gilbert, about whom he had considerable ambivalent feelings, and he sort of felt this was sort of unworthy of these things. Arthur Conan Doyle, very dismissive of Sherlock Holmes. He takes my mind from better things, meaning his big historical novels, The White Company, or his science fiction. He wrote the original of King Kong, The Lost World, but not appreciated for his Sherlock Holmes stories. So I don't have that problem. I'm just glad anybody liked anything I ever did. And I felt lucky because I was not expected or programmed to amount to much. It all goes back to, you know, was he lucky? Or maybe there were other things, but very, very fortunate. And I can't pick among them. I think in a non-aesthetic answer, easily the day after is the most important thing I've ever gotten to do with my life so far. I changed the mind of the President of the United States. I get him to sign the Intermediate Missile Treaty. Of course, the pussy grabber in chief, as you may know, has walked out of that treaty. But that's the world in which we find ourselves.
We've got a question in the back here.
I was concerned when about the infringement as far as the family was concerned, the Conan Doyle's family. And the copyright infringement. I was reading up on it because I thought, how does this happen? So
somebody said, where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. When I was 27 years old and telling myself that Holmes was out of copyright after a cursory examination on the back of a matchbox, I told myself I could write this. And then I found out that at the time, not only was Holmes still in copyright, but the Conan Doyle estate was one of the greediest, most rapacious group of people. And the thing that I think really offended me the most was they didn't care about Sherlock Holmes. It was just all about the money. And I got lucky, because a cousin of mine, an older second cousin, represented the Doyle estate. See, lucky. And I said, do you think they would? She said, no. I said, could you ask? She said, I'll ask. And it came down to something like, oh, he's your nephew? It was not a 7% solution, I can tell you. But that's how that book wound up getting published. Sherlock Holmes, for all of you who want to write your own, is now fair game. He is in the public domain. and despite their greedy and malicious. In fact, for big studios, you know, they wait until the movie's about to come out, and then they hit you with this threatened something. And for a big studio, it's cheaper to give them $10,000 to go away than take them to court, even though you will win if you do.
I got someone over here in purple coming towards you.
Why I wore the color. I was warned when I began in show business, in theater, beware of meeting your heroes, because you may be disabused of your illusions. To come here today and hear you be the voice I hear, the philosopher I know from, for example, The Day After, but also a man who can do Star Trek and do Arthur Conan Doyle. I'm going to ask a very prosaic question. How was it adapting your own novel as a screenplay?
It's a very good question. I think the thing you have to, the way I looked at it as a chance to improve what I had done. I got a second bite of the apple to do it. I also thought, when I saw Scott Turo's book, Presumed Innocent, I read the book, I saw the movie. And having read the book, I knew who done it. And I thought, that's a problem, because the audience is just going to see the working out of something that they already know. I said, and I didn't think my book was all that terrific. I thought the first half was really good. It was a great getting them together, and I love this scene in Freud's office. But I thought they needed a better mystery to solve, and maybe I could give them one and throw the audience off at the same time, which was to say, don't think this is going to be, you know, a coloring book version of what you've read. It's going to be a surprise, it's going to be different. So I looked at it as, in that sense, as an opportunity. I still think it's a screenplay with flaws, and the only disagreements I ever heard with the lovely Herb Ross, who made me part of the filming of it from the beginning to the end, he wouldn't let me into the cutting room. And I kept saying, get rid of it, get rid of it, get rid of it. And I didn't get to do that. And there are parts of the movie where I just grind the enamel off my teeth saying, anyway, I don't want to go on and on. I could give you specific examples, but everybody else would fall asleep.
Got another question in the same row.
I'm really enjoying this. But
You're the one, yeah, okay.
You've used two words, and I'm waiting for the third word to drop, and agent, publisher, and editor. And I, for the life of me, don't really know the distinction between three. Do you all always hate your editor? Does your editor work for you? Could you clear that up?
Well, I mean, agents are, the simple version of that is they are gatekeepers for either studios or publishers. They're clearinghouses so that by the time it gets to the publisher, by the time it gets to the studio, somebody has vetted it, and it comes with a certain imprimatur that means this is conceivably worthy of your attention. Publisher, that's a sort of a mystery to me because I'm not really a grown-up, and that's like real world. Editors is something different. There are very few editors left. Editor was a kind of a muse, somebody who would try to help make your book better. Now they're sort of deal makers. And I was on a panel with Michael Connolly, and said, the only word I want to hear from an editor is thanks. But there used to be, and I'm old enough to remember, after the Civil War, there were editors. People who would say, don't you think this would be better? And I got very angry over the years when I would say to my editor, what if we ended this chapter here and spilled over the other thing? He said, oh, that's a good idea. I said, well, where the fuck were you? I don't remember the question, but that's my answer.
Hello. I have two questions. One's a quick answer, I think.
Just pick one. Sorry.
Okay, I'll go quick. Screenplay, you lost out the 7% solution to what?
Oh, All the President's Men.
Oh, tough here.
I think it's cheating to have help from Richard Nixon. It's a practiced answer, yes.
Do you prefer to actually write your books or write for movies and screenplays?
Writing is, by and large, unless you're in a writer's room on a TV show, writing is a solitary undertaking. If it's your book, you're in charge. You're only limited by your own ability. If it's a screenplay, you are writing for hire, you are writing to help sell it to somebody, and whoever is writing those checks is going to have a lot to say about what you've written, depending on the budget, depending on what the star is, depending on what side of bed the guy got out of the day or the woman read your screenplay, whether it fulfills a whole bunch of, checks a bunch of boxes, I guess you'd say. It's different. Writing a novel or short story, you're on your own. What's different is between writing and directing a film is really different. Because writing, as I say, is mainly solitary, even if you're answerable to other people. But making a movie is a collaborative experience. You're going to have to work with people. And if you don't like people, that's going to be hard. But you are going to have to deal with budgets, weather, egos, accidents, a million variables that are going to have to make you psychologically, emotionally, and logistically a quick change artist in order to say, oh, the monkey didn't show up? We'll have to do something, shoot something else until he does. I'm terrible at that, by the way. I always want to know what happened to the monkey. So those are, in broad strokes, some of the differences.
Hi, Nicholas. I told you I saw you 50 years ago at the Sherwood Oaks College. That was pretty cool seeing you again. So I was happy when I saw your name show up there. I was curious. You mentioned you had an agent before you wrote the 7% solution. So I was curious how you got the agent before you actually had the book.
After college, after Iowa City, I went to New York and I was there for, I think, about 3 years. I was scared to go west. I had never been west. I had never heard anything good about it. And I later found out the reason is that people who go west and like it stay. So the only people I was meeting, people coming back and saying, oh, Los Angeles, really bad. So I went east after Iowa City, and I was in New York, and I got a job as a publicist. I didn't even know what that was. For Paramount Pictures, I worked on a movie called Love Story. And I was watching them make a movie, so I'm trying to learn something. And then I was trying to write plays or screenplays or novels and using Paramount's Xerox machines to copy it, but none of it was either selling or maybe it wasn't very good. And I thought, I have to write something that could sell. There's people saying, you know, what are you? And I would say, well, I'm trying to be a writer. It doesn't sound so good. So I thought, what could sell? Nonfiction. What could you write that's nonfiction? Well, you could write about the making of that Love Story movie. So it was about 6 months too late to do this, but I wrote something which was called What Can You Say About a 25-Year-Old Girl Who Died, was the opening line. But they changed it to the Love Story story. And I sold it. And I got an agent on the basis of the sale, because once somebody wants to buy something, they'll have an agent instantly. And the agent had a West Coast branch, So when I decided after 3 years I was going to try my luck in LA, I sent my 2 best screenplays to the West Coast branch of the agency that represented me in the East. I drove across country by myself on Interstate 80, becoming more terrified with every revolution. I had no big plan. Did it ever occur to me to look up where Los Angeles was? I didn't even know that was by the water. I didn't. That's a fact. I got off the highway somewhere near Los Angeles, found a payphone, and called this agent up and said, I'm here. And if he had said, who are you, or we have no interest, I had no alternative plan for my life. Lucky. But is he lucky? And they said, oh, we like your scripts very much, come in. And that's how that part of the story worked.
Boy, Michael said that your book was taken off the library shelves. Maybe I didn't read that.
It's a swipe at Ron DeSantis, the fascist dictator of California, Florida. Sorry. Basically, as we know, library shelves are rapidly being pruned, culled, and so this was a little bit of a swipe. It wasn't this book, presumably, that has been taken off the shelf, but the manuscript on which that book was. I think if you reread it carefully, if not, I'll write my editor, we'll fix it. Oh wait, there are no editors.
You're pretty much a man of leverage too, because you managed to, like, with time after time, you used the screenplay to get your job as a director.
Yes, it's the same trick that I did with the 7%. So you can buy the book, but I have to write the screenplay. You can buy the screenplay, but I have to direct the movie.
Right.
Yes.
Have you written 3? This is your 3rd Sherlock Holmes book?
This is my 7th.
7? Okay.
I have this website where they're all handily listed and they're all available on Amazon, and I would appreciate as many 5-star reviews as you can manage, because it helps. You know, there's a line in Gilbert and Sullivan in an opera called Ruddigore that not a lot of people perform, but if you wish in the world to advance your merits, you're bound to enhance. You must stir it and stump it and blow your own trumpet, or trust me, you haven't a chance. So I'm out here doing the best I can to stir it and stump it.
Have you done screenplays for any of the other novels?
No, I have not written. Universal, when they bought the 7% Solution, they also bought the West End Horror, which is a very good, almost the purest Sherlock imitation that I ever wrote. And that was a bestseller also for 3 months or something like that. And 7% wound up in profit. They made money on it. But if they'd made a lot more money, they certainly would have made the second one. Meanwhile, we have all these, the Sherlock Holmes revival I can take credit for, because nobody was interested in Sherlock until the 7% Solution. Now everybody and his brother does one, and there's Elementary, and there's Sherlock, and there's Sherlock's daughter, his mother, his brother, whatever. So yeah, they're all out there, all 7 of them now, waiting.
It's been wonderful to have you here today.
Oh, thank you. It's
as a lifelong Sherlock Holmes fan, I appreciate every moment of this. But my question is an active question. The Wrath of Khan was awfully good, and I was surprised. I was impressed how good Ricardo Montalban was, and I thought the director here really did some work, and I'm wondering if there's any stories connected between you and he.
There are a lot. First of all, I will say that I wrote a memoir. Everybody connected with Star Trek writes a memoir. When there used to be bookstores and I would see somebody else's memoir, I'd always go right to the index to find out what they said about me. So a lot of my history with Montalban on this film is in the memoir, but the short version of it was I didn't get to rehearse with him the way I got to rehearse with everybody else because he was in the middle of shooting his television series Fantasy Island, and I said, why did you do that? He said, my kid needed braces. Anyway, all I could do was have lunch with him. And I gave him a copy of Moby Dick, and I said, read this, it's all there. So he came in on the first day of shooting, which was his big scene, the opening scene, why he's so pissed off at Admiral Kirk. 6 pages of his agita. And I thought, movies is always, for the actor, coitus interruptus. You start to say, I love you, cut, we'll move the camera. And I said, wouldn't it be good, coming from a theater background, which is where I came from, if we could do it all in one and let him really work up a head of steam. So I mapped it all out for him. There were like 21 marks he had to hit. I was once in a movie and I couldn't hit 1 mark. And I only had 1 mark. So he was letter perfect. That's his real chest. Let's clear that off right away. That's him. He knew all his lines. He hit every mark. But he screamed it at the top of his lungs, and everybody was like, nobody, and I thought, this is only the 2nd movie I've ever directed, and this guy is way bigger, and he's got credits that are way longer. What's he gonna do if I try to tell him something? A friend of mine said all actors want to know one thing about the director. Is he crazy? Am I going to live? Do I have to pull the boat over the mountain? So Ricardo's affect was of extreme courtliness, an almost impenetrable carapace of politesse, something faintly aristocratic. So we got finished with this, whatever it was he did, and I said, okay, let's go into your dressing room or whatever it was, and talk about interpretation. And he nodded, followed me quietly on padded feet into this small room where there was just the 2 of us. And I said, Laurence Olivier once said that an actor should never show an audience his top, because once you show them your top, they know you got no place else to go. And he looks at me and goes, oh, you're going to direct me. He says, that's good. I don't know what I'm doing up there. And that courtliness all dissolved into this sort of shit-eating grin. And then he started to tell me stories about famous directors that he'd worked with, waited all his life to work with Mervyn LeRoy, who directed I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, I'm Dying for the Words of Wisdom. And what did it come out? Ricardo, Lana, make it a good scene. So we became intimate. This is as close as I've ever come to driving a Maserati. And I'll never come closer, because you didn't have to do much. He could finish your sentences. The moment I said to him, don't show them your top. And he would then say, Nick, what if I raise the eyebrow here? I would say, yeah, but not too high. is the opposite of directing Bill Shatner, who was, you know, the way to work around Bill was to get him to do it again and again and again. Then he'd get bored. And when he got bored, he got good. Because he stopped doing that. And I became very good friends with Ricardo. He was a lovely, lovely man. And I said to him, watching this, I said, you should be playing Lear, which he should. This was as close as he got. He finally got a role that brought out all the things that he could do, and he could do anything. And he made some deprecating remark about his Hispanic accent. I said, nobody's going to give a shit. You enunciate perfectly. And it's a shame he didn't get to do it.
You got time for one or two more questions?
I'm not on the clock.
Okay.
Hi, of course I'm a big Star Trek fan too, but, okay, I'm a big Star Trek fan, but you mentioned that you didn't like Basil Rathbone's acting interpretation of Sherlock Holmes. I think in the 80s there was another guy named Jeremy Brett, which we all saw here. It was a British production, but it was also on PBS here. And I thought he single-handedly brought back the entire interest in the Sherlock Holmes world.
After me.
Well, you didn't let me finish.
I never do. It's a terrible habit.
No, I was curious what your, I know you brought that interest, and Jeremy Brett did too. Well, at least that's my opinion. I don't know if that's your.
I'm sure you're right.
Okay. All right, thank you.
My problem with Rathbone was not exclusively his. As I say, partially it was the Watson. Also, it was partially taking him out of period and putting him in Washington and all that stuff. But my problem with him as an actor is that he looked like Sherlock Holmes and he sounded like Sherlock Holmes. I just, as an actor, could never see him thinking. I could never see the wheels going around. There are some actors who are very charismatic, but you don't necessarily see the emotions flicker. You know, Meryl Streep is amazing. You can follow everything. Gary Cooper is amazing. You can follow everything. But sometimes they're sort of doing all the things that they're supposed to be doing, but nothing is coming through the flesh. You know, and there's a difference between an actor and a movie star, right? So an actor pretends to be somebody else, and a movie star pretends somebody else is them. I made that up. But I think when you go to see Cary Grant, go to see Cary Grant. You know, but when you go to see Alec Guinness, where is he? When you go to see Fred Astaire, it's effortless. You can't see him breaking a sweat. You're not watching. It's easier to see Gene Kelly sort of doing his thing. Somebody said to me that there are artists that never let you forget that you're experiencing them. When you see Van Gogh, when you see Marlon Brando, you're never permitted to forget that this is Marlon Brando. It's Marlon Brando with Stanley Kowalski. It's Marlon Brando with Terry Malloy. But it's Marlon Brando. When you see Federico Fellini movie, you are not permitted to forget that you were watching Federico Fellini. Somewhat the same with John Ford. But then there are what he called the great invisibles. Alec Guinness, where is it? When you see Bicycle Thieves and you look at a movie directed by Vittorio De Sica, where is the director? How does this happen? That the camera just happens to be in the right place every damn time? And anyway, that's a kind of a difference Fred Astaire, it's invisible. You lose yourself in what's happening. In Alec Guinness, you're not watching Alec Guinness, you're watching Colonel Nicholson, you're watching Louis Mazzini in Kind Hearts and Coronets, and playing 12 different roles, no less. And it isn't a stunt. It's his art in action, the invisible part. The invisible part. And that lets you get into the story, as opposed to saying, God, look at what Marlon Brando is doing. Anyway.
All right, last question.
You guys must be getting
Who's
tired.
got a hand? All right.
There's a gentleman up here, I think.
Of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, which one would you say is, when you're writing, is the easier to put on paper?
It's easier for me to write Watson because I can more easily identify with Watson. I don't think Watson's a buffoon, but I think that Holmes is very vain. He doesn't want the admiration of an idiot. He wants the admiration of a regular person, and I guess I see myself in that category. It's much easier to pretend to be Watson. Figuring out how to make Holmes clever in 7 books. I'll take it out of you. Anyway, listen, thank you all.
You talk, for not knowing it very well. I also started reading Sherlock Holmes at 12 years old. Came in after 45 minutes.
Right.
But I have told her about it. I thought you might be.
But I enjoy it. So he's been on several times. He's